Hey everyone, it's Peter from Daydream Nation, and I've got Davey Cretin back to the channel. How are you, Davey?
Hello, I'm great. Thanks for having me back, Peter. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Now, today we've got a special episode. We are going to talk about bands that should have been bigger, if not for the record label. We have handpicked 3 selections each, and the record label is MCA. So, Davey, maybe you can talk a bit of background about MCA. Davey worked in a record store in the 80s.
80s, 90s, 2000s.
Absolutely.
So MCA Records started in about the 1930s or 40s, and they eventually progressed. And during the rock era from the 60s up, they were a decent label in the 70s. Steely Dan, Leonard Skinner, Elton John, they all had really good careers on the label. But then in the 80s, things changed. The industry changed. Everyone wanted hits. MTV was big. If you didn't have a big video or a big single, the record label did not hold you in such high esteem, as we're going to discuss. And I found that while doing some research on MCA, when I was in the record stores in the 80s and 90s, we started calling MCA the Music Cemetery of America. And I found out where it originated. And I've said that on a bunch of YouTube shows, and everyone always seems to get a kick out of that. But I found on the internet that it actually was a phrase. Frank Zappa had his boutique label and the name of Barking Pumpkin Records. And he was signed with MCA, and he put out Thingfish. And one of the ladies who was doing the transcription of the lyrics for the vinyl saw some of Frank Zappa's lyrics and freaked out. No pun intended there. But the label dropped Frank Zappa, and Frank Zappa started a campaign against MCA Records. Also, the MCA, one of the presidents was Irving Azoff, who was later known, and I think is currently managing the Eagles to great success, although they're controversial right now, but that's a whole nother story. So Irving Azoff and Frank Zappa were the ones who started saying in the industry, MCA stinks, they're a bad label, it stands for the Music Cemetery of America, because you know what? In their warehouses, they have zillions of unsold albums. They're printing up stuff, they're not selling it, they're losing money. So somehow that made its way to the record stores where I was working, and we joked that MCA was the Music Cemetery of America, as we're going to discuss here, by picking certain bands or artists to highlight it.
Absolutely. So what we've done is we've handpicked 3 acts each that we think commercially, if it was on another label, albeit maybe a stronger label like Warner's or CBS or Columbia, EMI, in America or other territories of the world, it would have had better prospects than being on MCA. So, Davey, what is your first pick? What is the first band that you'd like to spotlight? Should have been bigger, if not for the label.
Okay, well, to prove the point here, this band put out their debut album, March 6th of 1989. It's their only of their 15 studio albums not to hit the Billboard charts here in America. They switched labels a few years later and went on to huge success. In fact, they just got back with their founding member drummer, Mr. Mike Portnoy. They have a tour starting soon and a brand new record due later this year, early next year. No one knows. They're keeping it under wraps. Dream Theater. In 1988, early to like winter, spring 1988, they signed a deal with a label called Mechanic Records, and they were distributed by MCA. The label formed Mechanic to highlight heavy metal acts. Besides Dream Theater, they had Voivod, which was always a huge cult band from Canada, Trickster, who went on to have pop metal success, and also Bang Tango, who will figure heavily in my story here, and Dream Theater. The label loved their demos, and they thought they were a cross between Metallica and Rush, with some Kansas sticks, some commercial-sounding choruses thrown in. And the band thought, oh, the label loves our demos. They're going to push our album. We're going to be a really big band. A couple of months after Dream Theater released their record, and it didn't really go anywhere, the label made no videos for them. This is 1989, no videos on MTV, which hurt them. All they did was get Rush producer Terry Brown to remix 2 of the songs, and they sent it out to rock radio stations, but it didn't cross over. Terry Brown did remixes of Status Seeker and Afterlife, which have more punch and more cojones to them than the rest of the album, which is a little trebly, a little high. And it's sort of like the band members are sort of almost trying to outplay each other. So it's not the best production job. Production job on the album is by Terry Date. Yes, Mr. Terry Date produced the album. So they commissioned Terry Brown. They put out the singles. The album went nowhere. This is March. At the record store I worked at, there was a young lady named Leah, and she was friends with Mike Portnoy, the drummer of Dream Theater. All the band with the original singer, Charlie Dominici, came down to the store. I worked at the store that was well known on Long Island called Titus Oaks Record and CD Exchange. She had made a big display. The band came down. I met them all. They were all dressed in black leather. They looked really cool. I was like, oh, these guys with the hair and the black leather, they look really cool. They're rock stars. They signed her display. I have a poster somewhere that's signed by the whole original band. Maybe a CD cover, album cover, who remembers exactly. So I met the guys. They were nice guys. But when Bang Tango, 2 months later in May of '89, released their record, which was called Psycho Cafe, Bang Tango were more in the hair metal vein, and Dream Theater were progressive metal, more like Queensryche, Fate's Warning, that type of band. So they had less commercial appeal than Bang Tango. Bang Tango's record went to number 58 on the Billboard charts. So Mechanics MCA said, let's put all our money behind them. And they dropped Dream Theater like a stone, dropped the band. They fired their singer. There was tension in the band, probably because they got this record deal. They got dropped. What's going to happen? There has to be a change. Just like the Jets fired their coach today in American football. Someone's got to be the scapegoat. And Charlie Dominici, he was about 15 years older than the rest of the band, passed away last year, unfortunately, at 72. Very sad about that. And he was the scapegoat. The band got searched for almost a year and a half or so until they got a new singer, James Labrie, who's been with them ever since. But Dream Theater went on to Atco, through Atlantic, through Warner Brothers. Their next album in '92, Images and Words, became a hit album, gold record, and they've had a huge career ever since. They're, I guess, besides Fish, PH Fish, the American jam band, I would say Dream Theater are one of the biggest cult bands on the planet. They have a huge following in Europe and South America and here in America. I'm going to be doing a lot of content on the band coming up on my channel, Cretin Classics. So if you're a Dream Theater, check that out. Starting this month, it's going to be Dream Theater month for a long time, couple of months probably. So my first band, Dream Theater, did not chart with their first album. And obviously Mechanic Records had some problems because they weren't in business for too long and the label folded. So Dream Theater could have been bigger from the first album if they had the right push, but they didn't get it. So that's my first choice, Dream Theater on MCA.
That's a great pick. Straight off the bat, no video. So that's kind of commercial suicide.
Exactly.
In the 80s, if you don't have a video and you're not sort of, I mean, albums or songs wouldn't be selling without a video. It's just
it was a calling card.
Yeah, it's the simple commercial reality in the music business in the 80s. So that's just commercial suicide. Were they lazy? Was it a case that they just didn't have the budget? Was it incompetence? That's
everything.
Absolutely. I did an interview with Raven, the new wave of British heavy metal.
Right.
And they picked up a album deal with Atlantic Records. And when it came to the Packers Back, which was their glam rock album, which was completely different to the sonics of the new wave of British heavy metal, which was kind of aggressive. This was a very polished album. It had Eddie Kramer producing it. No video. And it sank like a stone, especially in the genre of hard rock and heavy metal, which is such a visual musical genre. It's all light and thunder and, dynamics. To not have a video is just a grievous mistake, isn't it?
Yeah, kills your momentum. There is no momentum. There's no video. There's no visual for people across America and the world to see you, to see what you look like, to see what you offer and sound like.
Yep, absolutely. Well done. That's a great first pick.
Thanks.
I will go to a band that was one of the godfathers of punk, Class of 77. They were there with The Clash. They were there with the Sex Pistols. And I'm talking about The Damned. Now, The Damned in 1985 put out an album called Phantasmagoria. Love the album cover. This kind of really kick-started the whole goth. I know there's going to be a lot of naysayers and say, no, they didn't, but they were definitely one of the visual front and center with goth. You just look at the album cover. Now,
that's exactly what I was going to say.
This is their most commercial album. It had a hit single. It wasn't originally on the album, but subsequent albums it was tacked on of that old classic hit Eloise. Went top 5 in the UK, top 5 in Australia. This album is their biggest selling album in the UK, went to number 11. There's so many tasty songs on it. It's kind of like it's got a little bit of Britpop before Britpop actually happened. It's got a lot of the Kinks. It's got a lot of psychedelia, a little bit of punk, but I would describe it as a goth rock album. Grimly fiendish, The Shadow of Love, Is It a Dream? It's Dave Vanian, doing that wonderful crooning. All the songs are beautifully arranged. But in regards to this album, this was a huge hit. In America, zero, nothing. Now, you can only put that at the hands of MCA. Now, a lot of people would say, maybe the Damned were too English, they were too gothic. Has anyone heard of a band called The Cure? If the Damned had a record label behind them like a Warner's or a Geffen Records, by the way, Geffen did actually re-release that album in Japan. If they had a rock-solid record company that had a marketing push, they would have found fans, because Gothic, that is a big fan base. And look at the feverish fan base of The Cure. I would put that in the same sort of category as The Cure if they had a record push, MCA, marketing in regards to the videos, and there were videos done into the stores. I think this band could have been as big as The Cure, if not bigger, because, there was just so many pop hooks, so many songs that just are a kind of ear whiz. It should have been huge. They did a follow-up in 1986, and that was Anything. It's not quite as good, but it has a great song, another cover version, the old love song, Alone Again, or in fact, I actually prefer the Damned's version to the Love's version. There's a few other songs, Gigolo, Anything, again, Sunk Like a Stone. So this is my first test case where I think a band that had a stronger monetary backup, a great marketing plan like your Warners or your Sonys. It wasn't Sony in those days, it was CBS, EMI, America, and they would have been much bigger. And I'm thinking of the test case in this instance, The Cure. What do you think, Davey?
I think that's a good choice. The follow-up, Anything, I remember I had just started working at a record store. It was a video store I worked at that became a video record store. And we had that on vinyl with an all brown cover. It didn't have that big splash of color in the middle. And the single was played, the cover of Alone Again Or was played on alt rock radio here, although they weren't calling it alternative rock, college rock radio back then. And I do have the 45 of Alone Again Or, and that's the first version I became familiar with. And like you said, I like that version a lot. It has like more drums on it, and it's the Love version has more strings, and this rocks a little more. It's more upbeat.
Yeah. I mean, it's not as good, the album, but I guess my test case always comes back to this. If the record label just gave it a little bit more push, I think they could have broken in America. I mean, they're still around. They still play in America in the clubs. I just think it's a total head scratch that they should be regarded in America, especially as highly as The Clash and the Sex Pistols, because their musicology is just out of this world. They've done some fantastic albums. They were the first band to put a punk album out. You know, Damn 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 came out before Nevermind the Bollocks and the Clash's first album. But, you know, needless to say, those two other bands have got more sort of in the spotlight than the Damned. But anyway, coming back to MCA, it's just an example of a band that should have been bigger if it wasn't for the record label.
Right. The whole thing, though, with that kind of music, it's very underground. And the only band that really broke through to huge success is The Cure, I would say, out of the whole goth scene.
But there have been examples of spot singles that have been able to break through, haven't they? Like Psychedelic Furs. That's sort of like, I mean, it's not in the wheelhouse, but it's in proximity. You know what I mean? Sort of those alternative bands in the later 80s, and especially when you had directors like John Hughes in a lot of those teenage movies, he was spotlighting a lot of those more alternative bands like Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, New Order. A lot of those bands were becoming more in the mainstream. So I'm just thinking that if MCA pushed it a little bit harder, they would have been up there with The Cure and those other bands that had some sort of success, even with their singles in the US charts. I mean, the college circuit was quite lucrative, wasn't it? You could have a nice, tidy career. You know, your album might chart in the lower 40s, and you could still go to gold certifications status. But you know, with this album, it just nothing.
It's just the way it worked out, unfortunately. Some bands become huge, and some bands are just cult bands.
Yep.
And it's usually at the hands of the record label. It's usually their fault, but not every band could sell platinum, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I go to your choice, do you have any recollection of this album in your record store? Any push, any promotion?
I remember seeing it, but it didn't really go anywhere.
And that's where I think MCA were just sort of, we print it, we deliver it, and that's where it ends. So as we go deeper into this show with different artists, there's a difference between a record label that really hogs the real estate of a record store and puts promotions, posters, displays, or just simply, here's the record, you put it in the, you know, the tray, and that's it. They expect it just to do its thing. And I think a lot of these albums that we're highlighting were just delivered to the record store, and that was where it ended.
No promotion.
Absolutely.
If something else gained traction on radio or video, the label went with that, and they forgot about all the other acts. Oh, we can make money on these guys, so forget about those guys.
Yep. All right, Davey, what's your second MCA choice?
Okay, my second band is a Canadian power trio, not Rush, the other big name from Canada, Triumph. Now, Triumph, they had 6 albums in Canada, 5 in America, that were on Attic in Canada, RCA in the States. But they were in a record deal with RCA. They got locked into a deal that they thought was unfavorable, and RCA wouldn't renegotiate the deal. So the band, Rick Emmett on guitar and vocals, Gil Moore on drums and vocals, and bass player, keyboard player Mike Levine. Emmett was sort of the music idea guy, and the other guys were more into the business and going to radio stations, managing the band. So while Emmett started on their 7th studio record called Thunder 7 in the studio, the other 2 guys were brokering a new record deal. They went to MCA. They spoke to Irving Azoff, and I'm not going to go into all the details about it, but in the Rick Emmett autobiography, Lay It on the Line, there it is, he goes into detail about this and how the band was in debt for $3 million to RCA. They had to put $3 million up to get off the label, to get out of their contract that the guys in the band didn't like. So Irving Azoff said, guys, you know, you had a big selling album. Allied Forces did well. Never Surrender did well. You're selling a lot of records in Canada. Come to my label. What I'll do is I'll pay RCA off the $3 million, but then you owe me the $3 million on your MCA record contract. So Gilmore, the drummer, Mike Levine, the bass player, they were the business-minded guys. They went with the deal. When Rick Emmett found out about it, he was not happy about this because he said, we're going to have to sell double platinum. And he goes into the details just to recoup what we owe the label. I don't think this could be done. Of course, the label wanted some outside songwriters. So there's a couple of songs on the 1984 album. Let me just get my stats here. That was all original Triumph songs. And that album went platinum in Canada, and eventually it went gold in America. But 17 plus years after it came out, it went gold in America in April 2003. So album number 8, The Sport of Kings, that came out in 1986, that's the one that had outside songwriters. And often for rock bands, that is just the kiss of death. I think the only 2 bands I could think of off the top of my head that ever escaped that, Bon Jovi, when they got What's-His-Face to co-write a lot of their hits in the mid-'80s, and Aerosmith with their huge comeback with song doctors all over the place. And of course, that alienates your hardcore rock audience. But the people who come into the band, they don't think about that. They don't check record credits to see who writes what. They don't care. But the real rock fans who love 70s Aerosmith, a lot of them do not like the comeback albums at all. There are great tracks on there. If you take away the singles, I think Aerosmith made some great albums, but I'm going off on a grand tangent over here. So getting back to Triumph, the label, they said, you got to have some hits on here. You got to sell more records than you did with the previous album. So what is it? 2 of the 11 songs on Sport of Kings are by totally outside writers, which never happened in the band. And then 2 of the other songs have co-writers on them besides the band members. So this was obviously label meddling, and Rick Emmett was not happy about it because the label got their hooks really into the band and messed up their creative process. Now, Sport of Kings went gold in Canada, but did not certify here. Before that, the label had released a double live album with 2 new studio songs, which went platinum in Canada, didn't certify here. So in America, they were still selling out huge arenas, trying for a big band on the concert circuit, but they weren't selling enough records to justify the money that MCA was putting into them. And Emmett was getting a little upset that there were outside writers in the band. He wanted to leave the band, but he knew it would be a problem extricating himself from the band because of all the legal stuff. He stayed for 1 more album, Surveillance. Again, it went gold in Canada, didn't certify here. In America, let's see, Sport of Kings, I didn't write it down, gosh darn it. But it got into, I think, number 35 on the charts, but then Surveillance only reached into the 100s. So there was a big drop off in sales. The label didn't like it. The band and the label were at odds. There were more song doctors and co-songwriters on Surveillance. Emmett left the band, and the band got dropped by MCA. Now, there were a lot of good commercial singles that, if the record label gave it the push, could have done well on AM radio. Besides rock radio, they were always good on rock radio, but Triumph never really crossed over to the commercial AM radio top 40 sales. And I always thought that was the fault of MCA because they had great pop songs. Somebody's Out There reached number 27 on the Billboard charts from the Sport of Kings in 86 under MCA's reign, but they could have given it a bigger push. And then the follow-up single, didn't hit the top 20, so they don't give the next single a push. And then it's a problem. The record just dies.
Yeah. Could I ask you a question? So just being as an Australian, and Triumph could barely get arrested in this country. I've got some of their albums. They're really strong. They're solid albums. Do you think as things got deeper into the 80s and bands were becoming a lot image conscious, it wouldn't matter if it was MCA, EMI, Geffen, they may have struggled because they're not a very image-orientated band. To me,
Right.
They hark back to the 70s where there's well-crafted rock songs. They're very serious musicians. And, inexplicably, they were included as part of the US Festival. They did a cracker of a set, but it seems like it sticks out a little bit, that it's all these crazy metal bands that are big on image, and there's Triumph. They do an outstanding performance, and it probably did give them a bit of a boost in sales in America, at least, off the back of that performance. Do you really think that as things got more into the MTV world and it was becoming more image conscious, it doesn't matter about MCA or not, they may have struggled?
A little bit, because they were a throwback band. There were only three guys. One guy is behind the drums. The guitar player, singer Emmett, was a good-looking guy. He's in his jumpsuits, his double-neck guitars, jumping and running around like a crazy person. But the other front guy, the bass guy, had long, straight hair and a big mustache. And he just looked like a relic from sort of the 70s, and it wasn't good for their image. The other guy, decent-looking guy, Gilmore, but he's locked behind the drum kit all the way in the back. Even though he sang about half the songs or so, they just never had a great image. I mean, Rush never had a great image, but their chops just lifted them, and they just had this great fan base.
Yeah, and they did some zany film clips in the mid-'80s that really sort of like Big Money or, Hold Your Fire. There was still some pretty zippy film clips that sort of caught your attention. And they definitely moved with the times with synth. There was a lot of synth pop. So I was thinking Rush when I was thinking that. But Triumph for me were kind of more traditional. But look, I think, MCA probably could have done more, and probably the wrong choice of label to push it, because if they went on something that was a little bit stronger like a Geffen, maybe they might have, pushed them in a bit more of a marketable position with their film clips and presentation and marketing. But MCA was just like, here's the album.
Yep.
Just put it over there and let's hope it sells.
And one last thing about MCA is after Rick Emmett left the band and they were reduced to a duo, they released in very early 1989 a greatest hits album, just saying, we've got to make our money back on this band.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was a cash grab, basically.
Yep. All righty. All right. Well, my next one is a band that is very dear to my heart, and I talk about them a hell of a lot on this channel. And that band is the Angels, or known in America as Angel City. The reason why they were called Angel City was because there was a very well-established band in America off the Casablanca label called Angel. So to avoid confusion, they called them Angel City. And I think even later they were called the Angels from Angel City, which is even more confusing. Anyway, The Angels were part of that AC/DC Albert label, that studio, that whole stock. They were their original stuff was produced by Vander and Young, legendary, fantastic live band, one of the greatest live bands I've ever seen. Doc Neeson was just an outstanding front person. They left the Albert's fold in late '79. They jumped across to Epic Records because they thought that they would get a bigger push. It didn't probably work out the way that they would have liked, because they were put on a lot of tours that just weren't suitable. I know that they toured with Triumph, and that was an absolute disaster. The Triumph fans were not too favourable to Angels or Angel City. They did a tour with the Kinks, and they were kicked off that tour because they were getting ovations. Legendary story at Madison Square Garden was the lights came on because the crowd were just sort of screaming for encores. Look, they were a fantastic band, so many great songs, and there's so many rock bands of 80s like Skid Row, Great White, Guns N' Roses, that Sight, the Angels, seeing them supporting and battling with Triumph, seeing them do those club tours, or seeing them supporting the Kinks as being an influence. So it's kind of amazing. This little cult band from Australia, inadvertently influenced a lot of bands, major, mega selling arena bands in hard rock. Anyway, so they're on the Epic label, and one album they did in 1984 was called 2 Minute Warning. One album only. Couple of tracks that, Look the Other Way, Between the Eyes, Sticky Little Bitch. It was a kind of I would say it sounds like AC/DC. There's a lot of Rolling Stones. There's a lot of pub rock. you think of the climate of American hard rock in that period, it should have done really bloody well, but it didn't. It stiffed and it sunk like a stone. So all I can suggest, without having the intimate knowledge of how it was marketed in America, it goes into that category of, here's the album, just put it up there, and that was it. Because it just did not sell. And I've looked at the chart placings. I mean, this album went top 10 in Australia, in New Zealand, but alas, in America, it did no business, but it should have, because it had that raw, aggressive hard rock sound that influenced so many of those other bands. Maybe it might have been slightly ahead of its time, but if it had the gutsy sort of marketing, and I think the best label, Davey, that was marketing hard rock and heavy metal in that era was Geffen. If they had a Geffen behind it, boy, this band could have reached for the stars. Davey, are you familiar with this album, or Angels, or Angel City?
Is that Angry Anderson's band?
No, that's Rose Tattoo. This is Doc Neeson. Okay. Yeah. Well,
there
you go, folks. So
they never had a big profile. I know Angry Anderson from Rose Tattoo. That's the band. Yeah. But the Angels never had a profile here.
And they also toured regions of America. So, Martin Popoff, he's a huge fan, close to us, dear to our hearts with the Contrarians. Right. There were certain areas that they toured, but that just goes to show no recognition. But look, should have been huge.
And the fact that they have different names in different territories, and they were known under two different names here, that's crazy. How can you build a following?
And some of their albums would be hybrid. It'd be a combination of two albums, which I artistically have issues with. I don't have this. I'm not favorable in any shape or form to albums that should be a combined of, say, let's just put the hits from this album and mix it with this album. It should be like the artist intended, just the one album.
Right. But that's record label meddling.
Absolutely. So no recollection in the record store of this band?
I'd see their records occasionally secondhand, used years later when I was working in the 90s.
But not in the day? Not live in the day? No. There you go. MCA. All right, what's your third pick, mate?
My third pick, our friend from Canada, Mr. Tim Derling, did a book on them, Let It Be Your Guide. There it is. Kansas is my third choice because the band were on Epic, Kirshner Records, through Epic, through Columbia, Sony, whatever you want to call it, in the 70s, through the early 80s. The band broke up, went on hiatus for a few years. They reformed in the mid-'80s with an altered lineup with Steve Morse on guitar, who was on my bigger list for MCA here. But Steve Morse was in the band with Steve Walsh. They signed to MCA. They put out Power in October of 1986. It went to number 35 on the charts. That album did very well. They had a number 19 single on the Billboard charts here with a song called All I Wanted. It was also top 10 on the U.S. mainstream rock chart in Billboard, and on adult contempo, as our good buddy Jerry Seinfeld would say, number 14. So this album, Power, did really well. The follow-up single, the title track, Power, it only hit number 84 on the Hot 100 and 38 on the rock chart. So basically MCA said, okay, that's it. They made a video for the third song, which was a cover of the Producers' song, the band The Producers, Can't Cry Anymore. It's a big power ballad. And Steve Walsh still had his awesome voice at the time, sang the heck out of that song. Great video, very funny video. It has Richard Belzer in it as the record producer of the song. And he keeps adding stuff. And you see like a marching band come into the studio. Very funny video, but got no airplay. It didn't chart because MCA didn't promote it. You figure with a top 20 single on the Billboard charts, you're going to really put your weight behind this band who had done better on the singles chart than their previous record 3 years before. But no, nothing. Crickets. So 2 years later, they get Bob Ezrin to produce a record called In the Spirit of Things. Comes out exactly 2 years later, October 88. Power went to number 35 on the Billboard charts here in America. In the Spirit of Things, number 114. One video, one single, and the song is called Stand Beside Me. It went to number 13 on the Billboard Mainstream Rock chart, not on the Hot 100 chart. At about this time, MCA noticed, hey, you know what's big? Teen pop. Debbie Gibson is selling well. We have Tiffany on MCA. She's doing really well. And they started dropping a lot of their older rock artists. And because In the Spirit of Things didn't perform, Kansas got dropped from the label. And it would be 8 years before they would do another studio album in the mid-90s. So once again, MCA, you got Bob Ezrin, who worked magic with Pink Floyd and The Wall, did great work with Kiss. And the record is like an afterthought. They discuss it a bit in Tim's book, which is a very good book. I recommend it to any Kansas fans out there. Tim has another book due out soon. So once again, it's MCA. I mean, besides, I mentioned before that, well, I should say MCA always did better with pop and R&B acts than they sort of did with rock bands, except Tom Petty, who I didn't mention before, Leonard Skinner, Steely Dan. Those are probably the three biggest selling bands, along with Elton John as a solo artist, on MCA. But a lot of times in the 80s, they were just dropping the ball left and right on artists. And Kansas did well with one album, and the second album, most fans probably never even heard.
Yeah, so folks, if you look at the balance sheet, it's the negatives that outweigh the positives. Yes, there are some, but so many in the graveyard that should have done much, much better. And, you know, the 80s wasn't a graveyard for 70s artists. There were so many artists that sort of had comebacks, reinstated their stature. Yes, Tina Turner, Deep Purple, so many comebacks. Steve Winwood, all these artists, that had a second wind, pardon the pun, with, in their middle age. David Coverdale and Whitesnake just needed a record company with a bit of marketing nous, a bit of push, a bit of guts, a bit of imagination. But I'm just getting the feel in researching this little topic and looking at all the artists on the roster that it was just simply a distribution line. Here's the record. Can you just put it over there, please?
Now, to be fair to MCA, I knew a guy who worked there. I'm not going to say his name because I'm still acquaintances with him. He did work for the label. He did come to the stores. He put up posters. He gave us posters to put up. He took pictures to bring back to the label. But you got to have the video on MTV at the time, and you have to get the radio airplay to push the bands. Yeah. Just going to record stores and making displays it's not going to be big news for the labels. You need that video and radio push.
Absolutely. Well, my final pick is somebody in the pop world. So this actually goes into the topic of not all the pop artists or pop rock artists they manage really well. This guy played at Live Aid. His first album, Human Racing, was a smash in the UK. He was cited by Elton John as one of the best singer-songwriters in the early 80s. He had a lot of push, and I'm talking about Nik Kershaw. So Nik Kershaw, Human Racing, Wouldn't It Be Good, was a top 5 smash around the world. This was on the MCA album. There's my little autograph. I saw him live. He's still an outstanding, fantastic talent. There was so much success with Nik Kershaw in the UK. He had another hit, I Won't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, which I think was also covered by Elton John. Anyway, within a 12-month period, unthinkable in pop world, he did a follow-up called The Riddle. And this did almost as well. Again, on the MCA label, big hits on this were The Riddle and Wide Boy. Played Live Aid. And to be selected to play Live Aid, you can't, not too shabby. So he was right up there in the UK and, the Australias and Asia, et cetera, and Europe. Everywhere except USA. So Human Racing went to number 70, and this album, I think, only barely scratched top 200. So There was a little bit of a British invasion occurring in America on other labels, Spandau Ballet, Duran Duran, Thompson Twins, George Michael's, Wham, even some one-shot hits here and there with different artists. You know, it was marketable. What happened with this guy? There is so many pop confections on this album, so many hooky, well-crafted songs. Just as a record, just as an artist, he should have been huge, but he wasn't because it's on the MCA. Are you familiar with Nik Kershaw?
That second album you showed, The Riddle, that was big in the cutout bins on vinyl. And I know the song, and I know Wouldn't It Be Good, right? Wouldn't It Be Good was from the previous record?
Yeah, Human Racing, yes.
Yeah, that got airplay. He got airplay on college radio, as we called it at the time. Before it was called alternative rock, the alternative radio stations. We called it new music or college radio, college rock. And that's where he was big, but he never broke through, and he was a good-looking guy.
Marketable, charismatic.
Yep.
He
Good
had
voice.
it all. But, you know, as I said, I'm thinking that there was a British invasion. There's no excuse that he couldn't have been bigger because it was in that sort of first half of the 80s where there was a real sort of appetite for anything British, especially in the pop world in America, because there was a second British invasion. So I can only sort of ascertain it must have been MCA. I'm sure there'll be some comments to say, oh, it was this and it was that, but I don't know. Was there, in your record store, any recollections? Were there any cutouts of Nik Kershaw? Were there any posters on the wall? Can you remember anything?
No posters. I saw that record, The Riddle, as a cutout more than anything. And it would go inexpensive, new or used.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was never a big seller here. And you know why? Music Cemetery of America.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it, folks. We've selected 6 and a wide genre of music. Davey, do you want to rattle off some other honorable mentions? I think you had a bit of a list. Just rattle a few, just, you know, without any detail.
The big one that I wanted to do, I didn't say Night Ranger. They were a hard rock band, a rock band that the label turned into a ballad band, and that killed Night Ranger, unfortunately.
They should have been top level, shouldn't have? So they were kind of second division. I don't say second division as in derogatory. I'm just saying they didn't reach those sort of Echion heights, did they? And
they should have. They had it all. Great, catchy songs. The heavy metal fans loved them because Brad Gillis, the guitar player, was in Ozzy's band. So he had a reputation. Oh, this guy can play with Ozzy.
Yep.
And they just never translated. They were big for a short time and then... Yeah. But I won't go into details. Also, Jafria, who had a big hit in America, top 20 song, Call to Your Heart. They had 2 records on MCA and then bye-bye. Second record didn't do nearly as well as the first one. And then Steve Morse, who played with Kansas. He had instrumental solo albums that did well. Some of them were on the Billboard charts and then MCA, and he sort of sank like a stone. And I had a list of 12. I'm not going to go through everyone in case one day we do a sequel, possibly. But
absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much, Davey. I think this has been really enjoyable. And the premise of this show is bands that should have been bigger if it wasn't for the label. And I think we've picked 6 mighty fine bands that should have been huge if it wasn't for the label. So please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. Tell us your comments of what you think of our choices. Maybe there's some other MCA bands that, you know, or acts that you'd like to put into this category. Davey, have you got anything that you'd like to plug on your wonderful channel? You recently did a show on the police with a special guest, Tia?
Yes, my girlfriend, my better half, my producer. Yep. She's in the video. We ranked the 5 studio albums by the police, along with my Blue Oyster Cult album ranking, my review of the new Deep Purple album, those are the latest videos I have up, and I got a lot of Dream Theater content coming up in the next bunch of weeks.
Absolutely. So I will put the link to Davey's channel. Please check it out. And Davey and I will. Yeah.
One last thing. Sorry, Peter will be on my channel before the end of the year. He and I are going to do the top 12 songs of a specific band, but we're not going to reveal it yet. But he will be on Cretin Classics.
Absolutely. Looking forward to that. But yeah, one thing's for sure, you'll see Davey and me doing more shows on Rock Daydream Nation, whether it's this year or beyond. Please like and subscribe, and cheers. Enjoy the rest of your evening.